Well, let's get to our panel right now. Joining us in the studio is Zhang. He's the chief correspondent with Shanghai Wen Hui Daily in Washington, D.C. From Beijing, we're joined by Tong Zhao. He's a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Also with us from Boston is Myung-Koo Kang. He is a professor of political science with Baruch College of City University of New York. And Jim Walsh is a senior research associate with the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Myung-Koo Kang, let me start with you. There have been tensions between South Korea and China over the deployment of this THAAD anti-missile system, which China, of course, opposes. In May, shortly after the election of the new president in South Korea, Moon Jae-in, efforts were made by both China and South Korea to ease these tensions. What are relations like right now?
I think currently both sides try not to escalate this, THAAD-related issue into a full-blown, any kind of major conflict in terms of trade or security-related conflict. So both sides try to be cautious in managing this current THAAD situation. For instance, in the South Korean case, the President Moon Jae-in demanded the environmental investigation as to this THAAD deployment, and then tried to respect the Chinese government concern. So I think we will see that whether there will be a summit meeting between two countries, China and South Korea, in August as scheduled. That will be a quite critical moment in terms of understanding the current THAAD-related tension between the two countries.
Song, President Xi Jinping met with President Moon in Berlin ahead of the G20 summit in Hamburg. That was just very recently. How would you describe current relations between China and South Korea?
I think it is in the process of normalization. And in fact, China's relationship with the last two conservative governments of ROK has been quite good, but especially during the later period of President Park Geun-hye, because of this DPRK's nuclear issue. And President Park chose to work more closely with American side and Japanese side. And she decided to accept the deployment of the THAAD and also have more cooperation with other two countries. I think China is feeling bad about that. And President Moon Jae-in has been labeled to be a liberal leader. And usually people believe he will have a more sunshine policy. But he visited Washington a few weeks ago, and he, I think, promised to continue the deployment of the THAAD system. So I think China is waiting to see whether President Moon will be able to do something more to make the atmosphere to be good for the cooperation between China and ROK.
Okay, let's go to Tong Zhao in Beijing. And Tong Zhao, China considers the THAAD missile system to upset the balance of power in the region. What exactly is China's concerns about the system? What can it do that concerns China?
Well, technically, in order for the missile defense system to intercept North Korean missiles, the South Korean missile defense system has to be interconnected with the American missile defense systems, especially their command control and communication systems has to be integrated into one in order to constitute a multi-layered missile defense network against North Korea. But also, at the same time, the same missile defense network among South Korea, US, and Japan could also constitute a major and a significant threat to China's core security interests. And the Chinese concern originates from two levels, basically speaking. At the regional level, the top priority of the Chinese military is to deter the US from military intervening in case of a regional contingency around Taiwan, South China Sea, or East China Sea. And the Chinese rocket forces constitute a major component of that so-called anti-access area denial capability of the Chinese military. However, this regional missile defense network could seriously undermine the Chinese A2AD capability. And more importantly, at the strategic level, given the geographical proximity between North Korea and China, any American missile defense system that could intercept North Korean ICBM would also at the same time be capable of engaging some Chinese ICBMs. Right. So the Chinese concern is that the joint South Korean-US missile defense network could also threaten China's nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis the United States, which is a core Chinese security interest.
Jim Walsh, South Korea is not just an ally of the United States, it's a treaty ally. They've signed a mutual defense agreement. So how does the United States respond to these concerns that are being expressed by China about the deployment of THAAD? And what is one to make of the fact that the new South Korean president is actually not so keen on the deployment of this anti-missile system?
Yeah, well, let's start with the second one first. President Moon's attitude towards THAAD. And I think, you were talking earlier in the program about the state of Chinese-South Korean relations. Would they improve or deteriorate, conservative versus liberal? I think what China has right now is a new guy in town with a very different approach. I think he's a skilled politician. During the campaign, he really navigated the THAAD issue and has navigated other issues in the U.S.-South Korean alliance. And so my guess is that THAAD will sort of muddle through. It'll get delayed a year because of an environmental assessment. But at the end of the day, once it was deployed, it was going to be very difficult to reverse that fact on the ground. And so now we're pretty much more about sort of living with that reality and keeping it from getting worse. And by worse, I mean being perceived by China as a potential threat in the future. I mean, I'm against that. I think THAAD's a terrible idea. But it's not going to threaten, I don't think, any Chinese ICBMs. The radar is an issue. The radar associated with the missile defense program is an issue for China. But I think, if there's goodwill here among the three parties, I think we can minimize the impact here going forward. But again, the thing that I want to underline here is Moon is his own person with his own style. And so that's good news for China in some respects because both want negotiation. But it's bad news for China in the sense that he's really going to be more Korean focused than anything else. And I think the recent Chinese pressure around THAAD backfired a bit, which is why everyone's looking to cool down. So my bottom line here is it's more complex. We have a new president. He doesn't have all his people in office, just like the person in Washington, but he doesn't have all his people in office, and he's a new guy, and I think it's going to be pluses and minuses for that relationship.
Myung-Koo Kang, the new president in South Korea, has said that he's in favor of dialogue with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Let's take a listen to what he said on this issue just a short while ago. Let's watch.
Okay.
In order to achieve permanent peace, the war on the Korean Peninsula should be declared over and a peace deal signed with the relevant countries. Through the comprehensive approach of North Korea's nuclear issue, I will enable a complete denuclearization and the signing of a peace treaty. Let me make myself very clear. We do not want the collapse of North Korea.
So these are pretty ambitious goals that President Moon is talking about a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, talking about the signing of a peace treaty. I mean, is that realistic?
Right. At the moment, it's not realistic because we should remember one simple historical fact. South Korean government has never, ever signed the truce agreement. So when, 64 years ago, to end the Korean War, 3 countries signed the truce agreement: China, North Korea, and United States. And at that time, South Korean government even didn't agree to this truce agreement at all. And right now, if we look at the South Korean constitution or North Korean constitution, both Koreas do not recognize the legitimacy of the opponent power. So according to South Korean constitution, North Korean government is not a legitimate government at all. And then from the North Korean constitutional point of view, South Korean government is not a legitimate country at all. So it's a tricky situation, although these 2 Koreas, the members of the United Nations, but both Koreas have never cross-recognized the legitimacy of governments. So the President Moon Jae-in's suggestion, wishful thinking that reaching a peace treaty and then reunification, some peaceful coexistence. But from the beginning, we need to think about, cross recognition of the legitimacy of both governments on the Korean Peninsula.
Jim, what is your view on this? Is it wishful thinking? What would the U.S. consider these proposals to be?
Well, I think one thing about Mr. Trump is that he's in some ways a pragmatic person. So if something works, he's inclined to go with it. So I would not be so pessimistic. I agree that there are lots of reasons for pessimism. But in a variety of the Track 2 discussions, these informal discussions North Koreans have been having with great proliferation, I might say, with indirect talks with retired officials and that sort of thing, they seem to express an interest in having a dialogue. Obviously, South Korea wants to have a dialogue, and China wants to have a dialogue. If the three of them agree to something, then my guess is that the U.S. would participate. And so I think it's possible. Obviously, given we have this sort of rainy season in affairs on the peninsula. Well, once we go into war exercises or military exercises, sort of everything shuts down for a while. And so we do have that as a looming deadline. But I would not completely write off the possibility that there might be some progress here. And Pyongyang is having its own problems right now. So I guess I'm ever cautiously optimistic, although it's a very tough problem.
Tong Zhao, let's look at this from Beijing's point of view. The Chinese foreign minister came out with the so-called dual suspension proposal, and that proposal would see the DPRK freeze its nuclear and ballistic missile program, and in return, the United States and South Korea would halt their joint military exercises. Is that still the position of the Chinese government, or would the Chinese be looking at perhaps a more comprehensive settlement, which might include a treaty, a peace treaty, as well as a nuclear-free peninsula?
I think China is still very supportive of the comprehensive settlement with the peace treaty, because we really need the peace treaty to fundamentally eliminate the North Korean incentives to maintain their nuclear arsenal. However, even there is going to be a peace treaty, the responsibilities of the United States and North Korea in such a treaty would be very asymmetrical. Basically, the United States would commit not threatening North Korea, but that commitment is basically a political commitment that can be taken back, that can be withdrawn overnight by the United States. However, the North Korean responsibility would be to eliminate its nuclear arsenal, which will mean material change to North Korea's capability to defend itself. Therefore, I think it's very difficult for North Korea to trust the United States and therefore to commit upfront to the ultimate goal of denuclearization at this moment, given the deep mistrust between the two sides. Therefore, I think the Chinese view is to be more realistic. Given that the denuclearization and peace treaty won't be achieved overnight, we should seek to at least diffuse the tensions by reaching a near-term agreement, something like a freeze agreement that can cap the North Koreans' nuclear and missile programs.
Song, the United States has said more than once that it wants China to do more to diffuse these tensions on the Korean Peninsula. What can China do? The Chinese have expressed their concerns that pushing the DPRK too hard could result in instability on the Korean Peninsula and could result, as the Foreign Minister of China had said, in chaos on our doorstep.
Mm-hmm. I think U.S. has been pushing China in the last couple of years, and this government is continuing to pressurize Chinese side. Yes, they believe that China can reduce our energy supply to North Korea. They believe China can reduce our normal trade relationship with North Korea, and they believe China can also remove those kind of Korean laborers working in China. They believe China has all the leverages. But China is saying that we are ready to do that. We are willing to work together with other parties to pressurize North Korea, but within the UN Security Council resolution. And China believes more strongly that this kind of a sanction won't make North Korea to be finally ready for denuclearization. We believe that only negotiation and diplomacy can solve the problem. And I think that now the major problem is that the U.S. is putting too much higher precondition as this denuclearization to have a negotiation with North Korean side. I think that is a little bit too difficult for the negotiation to start.
Myung-Koo Kang, is there any merit in perhaps South Korea taking smaller measures, South Korea and the others involved in this, baby steps, if we could put it that way? Perhaps a resumption of family reunions as well as a resumption of the Sunshine Policy, where the DPRK and South Korea were engaging in joint industrial trade projects?
Of course, I mean, definitely it'll be helpful in terms of reducing the current tension going on related to North Korean nuclear and missile crisis. But the key problem is that what kind of real incentives does the North Korean regime will take from the inter-Korean talks or dialogue? For instance, we need to think about from the perspective of the North Korean regime. So in terms of economic benefit, Kaesong Industrial Complex reopening or re-beginning, I mean, resuming the tourism to the mountain Kumgang, all those, inter-Korean cooperation will be really beneficial to North Korea. But what we have to think about is that North Korean regime, to a certain degree, has muddled through the international sanctions. So if you look at the last year North Korean trade volume, it has increased. And then according to South Korean Central Bank's estimation, North Korean economy grew almost 4% last year. So despite all those international sanctions against North Korean regime could survive and muddle through. So from that point of view, what kind of real economic benefit can the South Korean government can provide to North Korea? So from the North Korean perspective, more direct, high-level talk with the United States to get some, resume survival or guarantee or peace treaty or reducing the joint military exercise, that'll be more important, concern and agenda. So in that context, real concern is that North Korean regime may not agree to, such kind of really small baby step, cooperation between the two Koreas.
Jim, the U.S. Congress wants to impose more sanctions on the DPRK. That seems to be the default position when they can't get any kind of agreement. And as we've just heard, the sanctions that have already been imposed have not really worked. We've seen economic growth in the DPRK. So what's the thinking here in Washington? I mean, the end game is getting rid of nuclear weapons. Is sanctions going to be the way to get there?
Well, you and I have discussed before, I think, my skepticism about sanctions, and my colleague John Park at Harvard and I have written a study interviewing North Korean defectors who worked for companies whose job it was to evade sanctions. And so we talked to them about how they did their job. And so I do have some doubts about it, as does my colleague. But I think they're very fixated in Washington. I mean, it's all about sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. This last bill that was just passed in Congress had sanctions for Russia, for Iran, and for North Korea. So it is the tool du jour, I think. But I would say this, though I've been a skeptic of sanctions, when the question was asked, what is North Korea's incentive for joining the talks, I think we have to be careful that not all trade is created equal. And so Pyongyang has had gas rationing. When you're gas rationing in the capital city, that's not a good message to be sending to your elite followers. And it appears China has reduced its purchase of coal from the DPRK, and that's crucial in particular because it provides foreign exchange. So there may be some things that China has done that have gotten North Korea's attention. Of course, they are also suffering from various weather events. So there's a possibility. Again, as I say, they say at least in track 2, in unofficial, informal dialogues for whatever they're worth, they keep saying that they're, in theory, open to it. So I agree that all the parties should come without preconditions. Now, none of the parties should have preconditions, and they should just sit down and start talking.
Tong Zhao, South Korea has proposed military talks with the DPRK, as well as restoring those hotlines, military hotline as well as a government hotline between the two countries. What is China's view on that?
I think China is very supportive of the recent steps taken by President Moon Jae-in to restart military communications with North Korea, to resume people-to-people exchange. Those are very positive and constructive measures. However, on the other hand, South Korea is also sending mixed signals. South Korea is still working with US and Japan to strengthen the existing economic pressure against North Korea, and South Korea is more committed to building its so-called kill chain military capability that aim to quickly kill North Korean top leaders and other critical military command control systems at the early stage of a crisis. So I think those mixed signals are making North Korea more hesitant to fully embrace the South Korean proposal. But more importantly, I think for North Koreans, they want to improve North-South relationship, but they care more about US-North Korea relationship. They believe their regime survival is really affected by the United States at the end of the day. So I think the North Koreans are at this time taking time to have South Korea working on persuading their ally, United States, to be more flexible, to be more willing to directly engage with North Korea.
Song, there used to be a time when there was a diplomatic process underway to resolve this. It was a multilateral diplomatic process known as the six-party talks. Then the DPRK got branded a member of the axis of evil by President George W. Bush, and those talks collapsed. But the framework for those talks, are they still relevant? Are they still valid? Could they be revived, or have events on the ground moved on?
I think U.S. government, Chinese government, and also other governments have shown sympathy to revive this six-party dialogue. And it was not terminated during Mr. George W. Bush's government. It was terminated in Mr. Obama's government. And I think North Korea fundamentally doesn't want this six-party talks. They want one-to-one dialogue with America, but America doesn't want to talk with North Korea separately because they don't trust North Korea. And I think recently also some U.S. intellectuals have been suggesting this six-party dialogue can be a very good platform in the future for the North Korea nuclear issue, because it not only brings six different countries together and also will take care of their separate concerns, but also it will be a very good platform for different countries to negotiate the long-time peace agreement and the security concerns in northeastern Asia. That will be a very effective kind of format, in my opinion.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.